So yes, the story I'm going to tell you is actually from County Durham, and it's quite a well-known one, I think. I've heard it before. It's on the Weardale Fairies, or the Fairies of Stanhope. And it concerns a man who had a quest to go to the fairies to try and retrieve his daughter that had been snatched away. For the little girl had done all her chores that day, and she'd gone up to her mom and said, "Can I go out to play?" And her mother said, "Yes, but stay close to home. So you do not go up into the hills, because I've told you about the fairies and what they'll do." But it was bright and sunny out there that day. And the little girl forgot what her mother said, and she went high up into the hills. And there she came to the riverbed when the fairies lived close by. There before her spread out a carpet of primroses, flowers, gold and yellow. She sat down and she began to pick flower after flower after flower after flower. She could feel the sun beating down on the back of her shoulders, top of her head, and her arms. She could hear the birds singing sweetly in the branches of the trees close by, and the water as it rippled over the stones of the flowing river. There was peace until she heard the strains of wild, raucous music beginning to swirl around her, drifting like a fragrance. She forgot what she was doing. She got to her feet and the flowers scattered all around her. And she went off in the direction of where that music was coming from. And sure enough, she came to a granite face of a rock boulder. Crack in the middle of it. Out of curiosity, she went up and she peered through that crack. The stone felt cool on her cheeks. She could see flashes of color. And there in the hollow of that rock, she saw fairies with dresses the colors of rainbows, fluttering and flittering and dancing and singing to that wild, raucous music of pipes and fiddles. Oh, she was fascinated. She kept her eye to that crack in that rock, and she watched them for hours after hours after hours until she felt the chill of evening settle on her. She pushed herself away, and she saw that shadows had started to lengthen and the sun was going down. She'd never been that long away from home before. So she quickly turned and ran along the river, beside the riverbank, through the carpets of primroses, down the hill, down to the farm where she lived with her parents on the edge of the village. She ran in through the cottage where she found her parents stood by the fireplace in the kitchen. They turned as she entered, and they looked worried, but they could see from her face that it was flushed, it was excitement, and her eyes were glowing. "Where have you been?" they said. "Oh, I've seen them," she said. "I've seen the fairies. Oh, and they're so lovely, and the music is so wonderful." Her mother knelt down and grabbed her daughter by her shoulders and said, "Did they see you?" "No, no," she said. "That's a relief." Then the woman looked above the head of her daughter to her husband and said, "Go to the wise woman. Ask what help we can do." And the husband nodded and was gone. Out of the cottage, out of the house, down past the farm, down the lane, into the village, across the village, till they reached the outskirts of the village. They came to the tumble-down cottage where the old wise woman had lived for many years. He banged on the door, and for what seemed like a time, he heard a shuffling, and the door opened a few inches, and he saw the old wizened face of the woman, with her hair neatly bound up in a bun and a shawl wrapped around her. "Yes," she said, "we need your help." She could see by the expression on his face something had happened. She opened the door. When he went in, she beckoned, pointed to a chair for him to sit. She closed it behind him, and then she went and sat opposite him and said, "Now, tell me everything." And he told her about the daughter going up into the hills and seeing the fairies. When he'd finished, she shook her head. "They'll come for her tonight." "What can we do?" he said. "Well, return home," she said. "Take your little girl to bed and tell her not to say one word, to keep silent all night long. For the fairies hear even the drop of a pin they will snatch her away. And you and your wife are to go and to silence your house. He thanked her and pressed a coin into her hand and left. When he reached home, he went into the kitchen where he found his wife sat by the fire, holding their daughter, rocking her back and forth, for the spell of enchantment had worn away, and the little girl clung to her mother, frightened. Together, as they took their daughter up to the bedroom, he told his wife what the wise woman had said. They undressed the little girl and tucked her into bed, and they told her to stay quiet, to not utter a single word. They went downstairs and began to silence their house. They put rags into the clocks to stop the pendulums from chiming. They overfed their dogs and their cats, so much so that the animals slithered off into the bliss of overfed sleep. They quickly put out the fire, and then the couple sat down at the kitchen table, held each other's hands, and as the darkness began to grow and silence descended on the house, they waited. The hours passed, and the darkness grew. And then they heard, outside in the courtyard, the pawing of the little hooves of the tiny fairy horses. They heard the head tossing as the bridal silver was rattling. They heard the whinnying, and then they heard the thin, reedy voices of the fairies outside. And the couple held their breath. Time passed, and one of the little fairy horses tossed his head and whinnied and stamped his hooves on the cobbles of the courtyard, and upstairs in the little girl's bedroom, a small dog growled and then barked. The couple released hold of each other's hands. They'd forgotten about the little terrier that had always gone to sleep every night in their daughter's bedroom. They got up from the kitchen, ran out, up the stairs, opened the daughter's bedroom, where they found the bed empty and the little dog cowering underneath the bed. All night long, the wife, little girl's mother, sat by the fire, groaning, moaning, and sobbing, inconsolable for the loss of her daughter. Her husband, the farmer, outraged, grief, everything crowding in, walked up and down, up and down. What could he do? It was at the breaking of the dawn of the next day. He found himself on the outskirts of the village, at the tumble-down cottage where the old wise woman lived, banging on the door. And for what seemed like a time and eternity, she heard the shuffling eventually, and the door opened, and the old wise woman rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. She became alert when she saw the expression on his face, that all had not gone well the night before. She invited him in. He sat down and he told her everything. When he'd finished, she shook her head again. He said, "What can we do? Is the situation hopeless?" "No," she said, "it is not hopeless. But this time you will have to go to the fairies, and you will have to appease them with 3 gifts. "What are the gifts?" he said. "Well, the first one has to be something that shines a light that does not burn. The second is you take a part of an animal and you shed no blood. And the third is a bird without any bones." This made him furious. "Riddles! You give me riddles," he said. She replied, "But you will find your answer when you least expect it." And as she rose from her chair and began to show him the door, and she said, "You will need something else." She opened the door to her cottage, and then she reached up outside and plucked off a sprig of rowan, the rowan tree that grew over the entrance of her cottage. "Here," she said, giving it to him. "This will protect you against the magic of the fairies. Now, I wish you well." And she closed the door behind him and with that sprig of rowan he put it in the top pocket of his jacket. Well, he walked out down the path of the cottage, through the village, his mind full of what were those answers of riddles, and full of the grief at the loss of his daughter. He left the outskirts of the village and began to walk along country lanes towards where he lived, the farm. And as he did so, he collided with an old man who was walking in the opposite direction. Old man dressed in rags with a stick, carrying a bundle on his back. The farmer said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he looked at the old man and reached into the hand pocket of his trousers and pulled out a silver sixpence. "I think you have need of this." And he pressed it into the old man's hand. The old man said, "Thank you." But he peered into the face of the farmer. "I think you have worries, my friend. Can I help you?" And the farmer smiled. "Well," he said, "can you help me with this riddle? What is something that gives off light but does not burn?" The old man threw his head back and roared with laughter. "I have lived on the road for many years," he said, "and I've slept under many a hedgerow." And he reached toward the nearby hedgerow and he plucked out a small beetle. "This," he said, putting it into the hand of the farmer, "this is a glowworm, a firefly. That is something that burns a light that shines a light that does not burn." And the farmer smiled and thanked him. And the two men went their separate ways. And the farmer took out a handkerchief and he put the little glowworm into it and he rolled it up and put it in his pocket. And as he walked along that country lane towards where he lived, he began to think of the second riddle. Apart from an animal that when you take it does not shed any blood. And as he looked down on the grass, he saw something metallic move. He stopped. It was a copper-colored lizard. And he thought, the tail. And he made a grab for it. And he grabbed hold of the tail and it broke off and the lizard scuttered up into the undergrowth and left that wriggling tail in his hands. The part of an animal that, when you take it, does not shed any blood. Took out the handkerchief from his pocket, opened it up and put it next to the glowworm and rolled it up and put it back in. The third riddle, the bird without a bones. He was nearly home when he heard a squawk and a squeal, and flashing before him was a thrush being chased by a hawk as it swooped down. Without thinking, the farmer reached down for a stone off the ground and he threw it at the hawk, which, startled, flew away in another direction. And the thrush, out of gratitude, landed on top of his roof and began to whistle a song of thanks. And as he sang, the farmer heard the words, 3 days by 5 days on egg sits hen, chick within, no bones by then. The answer to the third riddle. It was a chick inside an egg. Well, by that time he was home. He went straight in, and there he was confronted by his frantic, worried wife. He told her everything that the wise woman had said. And then they went out into the back to the hen house, where they knew a hen was laying on an egg of nearly 15 days old. Going inside, they saw the nest, and there he reached under the squawking bird and took out the egg. Brought out of his pocket that handkerchief and put that egg next to the lizard's tail and the glowworm, and he folded it up and put it back in. And he said to his wife, "I'll see you tonight with our daughter." And he was gone. Trekked up into the hills and soon came to the riverbank, where he saw the carpets of primroses and the flowers that his little girl had picked up the day before and had scattered on the ground. He then, as he stood there, heard that music, that strain of wild, raucous music. And he turned and followed the direction for where it was coming from. And he soon was faced with that granite face of that boulder, with the great crack in the middle. The music by this time was loud and it was wild. And he went up to the crack and he peered inside, and saw the flashes of colour of the fairies in their dresses of rainbow colours, flittering and fluttering and dancing and leaping and singing. He also saw his little girl sat there in the nightdress that she was dressed in from the night before, looking pale and frightened. And anger took hold of him. He took out from his top pocket that little sprig of rowan, and above the din of that music he shouted out, "Give me back my daughter!" And the music stopped. And he then heard a skittering coming through the crack in the rock. And all around him, what flew out one after another, were fairies, hissing, buzzing, fizzing all around him, but not able to touch him, for there he held fast to that sprig of rowan, and he held fast to his resolve, and he held fast to his request. And from inside the hollow of the stone he heard a thin, reedy voice saying, "Well, mortal, what will you give us in return for your daughter?" And he replied, "I will give you something that, when it gives light, does not burn, the first of the three gifts. The second is a piece of an animal that I have taken that has not shed any blood. And the final one, the burr without any bones. That is what I give you." As he took it out of his pocket, and he laid it at the base of that rock. And the fairies that were hissing and buzzing and fizzing all around him scooped down and picked it up and slithered back through the crack in the rock and were gone. And then the music started again, raucous, wild. There was laughter and singing and joy. And the man stood outside that rock face, holding that sprig, wondering where his daughter was. And then he felt a little tug down the side of his jacket. And he looked down, and there she was, once more at his side.